The airport arrival gate is usually a place of tears and reunions, but for Clarice Holloway, it was a place where a decade of breathing felt like it had been sucked out of the room by a vacuum. The air in the terminal was thick with the scent of overpriced coffee and jet fuel, but Clarice only smelled the metallic tang of fear. Her hands, calloused from years of working double shifts at the laundry and selling her family's ancestral gold to pay for a visa that wasn't hers, shook so violently that the welcome home sign she'd spent all night decorating fluttered like a dying bird. She had spent 7 years, 3 months and 12 days waiting for this moment. She had lived on crackers and water so he could have textbooks and designer suits in London. She had ignored the whispers in the village, the warnings from her mother, and the deafening silence that had grown between them over the last year. "He's just busy," she'd tell her reflection. "He's building our empire." Then the sliding glass doors hissed open. The man who stepped through wasn't the lean, nervous boy she'd kissed goodbye at this very gate nearly a decade ago. This was a man carved out of confidence and expensive wool. Julian Torrance walked with the gait of someone who owned the ground he stepped on. Clarice's heart leaped, a painful, desperate thud against her ribs. She took a step forward, her voice catching in her parched throat, ready to scream his name, ready to collapse into the arms she'd paid for with her own youth. But Julian didn't look for her. He didn't scan the crowd for the woman who had sent him every cent of her inheritance. Instead, he reached back and caught the hand of a woman who looked like she'd been stepped out of a high-fashion magazine, pale, polished, and glowing with the ease of someone who had never known a day of hunger. "Julian." Clarice's voice was a ghost, lost in the roar of the terminal. He heard it. For a split second his eyes shifted. They landed on Clarice, standing there in her best dress, a dress that was now 5 years out of style and frayed at the hem. His gaze didn't soften. It didn't fill with guilt. It went cold. It was the look a man gives a beggar he's already decided to ignore. He turned back to the woman at his side, tucked her arm into his and whispered something that made her laugh. He walked right past Clarice. He walked past the woman who had birthed his dreams in the ashes of her own life, and he didn't even blink. Hello to all our beautiful viewers joining us today. My heart is truly racing as we dive into this story. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say a huge hello to our incredible community. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in a quiet living room or on a busy train, I hope you're doing well. If you've been moved by stories of resilience and truth before, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our family here. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep telling these powerful stories. Are you subscribed yet? Drop a yes in the comments if you are. As Clarice stood frozen, the sign slipping from her fingers and hitting the linoleum floor with a hollow thud, the reality settled in like a coat of lead. The man she had built was now a stranger who had deleted her from his narrative. He wasn't just back. He was back with a life that had no room for the woman who had paid for it. How do you survive when the person you gave your soul to pretends you're a ghost? How do you fight a man who has used your love to buy a weapon against you? Clarice looked at the discarded sign, then at the retreating back of the man she once called husband, and a new sensation began to replace the crushing grief. It was cold. It was sharp. And for the first time in 7 years, Clarice Holloway wasn't waiting. She was waking up. The drive back from the airport was a blur of neon lights and the smell of stale upholstery in the back of a cheap taxi. For Clarice Holloway, the interior of her small, cramped apartment felt like a tomb. Every corner of the room was a monument to a man who no longer existed. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of their wedding day, Clarice in a handmade lace veil, her face radiant with a localized sun of hope, and Julian, looking young and terrified, gripping her hand like a lifeline. She had been the daughter of a hard-working tailor, a woman who found beauty in the precision of a stitch and the durability of a well-made coat. When she met Julian, he was a brilliant but penniless student with dreams that reached far beyond the dusty streets of their hometown. Clarice hadn't just loved him, she had worshipped his potential. She had spent the last 7 years working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at dawn, sewing alterations until noon, and waitressing at a grease-slicked diner until midnight. Every cent, minus the bare minimum for rent and bread, was wired to London. She had deferred her own dreams of opening a boutique, watching her hands grow rough and her eyes grow tired, all to ensure Julian Torrance could become the architect he always claimed he was meant to be. Her deepest fear had always been that he would realize he was too good for her, but she had countered that fear with a relentless, sacrificial devotion. He thought loyalty was a currency that bought forever. "I did this for us," she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking. "I gave you my blood, Julian." As she sat on the edge of her bed, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Evelyn Vance, her oldest friend and the only person who knew the true extent of Clarice's financial ruin. Evelyn was a sharp-tongued librarian who had spent years trying to get Clarice to see that Julian's emails were getting shorter and his excuses more elaborate. "Did he land? Are you guys at the hotel? Please tell me he cried when he saw you." Clarice couldn't find the strength to type the truth. "How do you tell the person who warned you, 'I told you so,' that you were standing in the middle of a wreckage you funded?" The supporting cast of Clarice's life was small but fierce. There was also Arthur Sterling, the elderly owner of the hardware store next to her laundry shop. Arthur had become a surrogate father to her, often slipping her extra cash for errands he didn't need run, sensing the desperation behind her stoic smile. He knew she was waiting for a ghost, and he had spent years gently trying to steer her toward a life that belonged to her, not a man across the ocean. But Julian had secrets that Clarice was only beginning to glimpse. As she finally forced herself to open her laptop, the one Julian had asked her to buy him 3 years ago but then forgot to take, leaving it for her to use, she found an old synchronized cloud account he had never logged out of. Her breath hitched. There were folders. Folders full of photos from the last 2 years. There was Julian at a gala in the Alps. Julian on a yacht in the Mediterranean. And always the woman from the airport, Lydia Montgomery, daughter of a real estate mogul. In the photos, Julian looked like royalty. He wasn't the struggling student Clarice was sending $500 a month to 4 rent assistants. He was a man living a lie funded by a woman he'd left in the shadows. The most devastating discovery wasn't the luxury. It was a scanned document. A marriage certificate from a year ago. He hadn't just moved on, he had committed bigamy. He had married Lydia while still legally bound to Clarice, likely using his single status on foreign paperwork that Clarice herself had helped him file. The empathy she felt for her younger self, the girl who skipped meals to pay for his textbooks, suddenly curdled. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. She realized that Julian hadn't just ghosted her. He had used her as a stepping stone and then tried to kick the stone into the river so it would sink. He thought she was weak. He thought she was a provincial girl who would cry in silence and fade away. But Julian had forgotten one thing. He had spent 7 years teaching her how to survive on nothing. He had inadvertently built a woman who was unbreakable. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, accusing shadows across the room, Clarice stood up. She walked to the mirror and wiped the smeared mascara from her face. She looked at the calluses on her fingers, the marks of her labor, the receipts of her sacrifice. "You want to pretend I don't exist, Julian?" she murmured to the reflection. "Then I'm going to be the ghost that haunts every single thing you build." She wasn't just a scorned wife anymore. She was a creditor, and it was time to collect the debt. The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a sharp, stinging contrast to the smell of laundry detergent that had defined Clarice's life for a decade. She stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't belong here in a dress she'd spent 48 hours straight tailoring from a discarded bolt of silk, but she belonged here more than the man of the hour did. The event was a welcome home gala for the city's newest architectural prodigy. Julian Torrance was being celebrated for his visionary designs. Designs Clarice recognized from the sketches he'd mailed her years ago, the ones she had critiqued and encouraged while sitting at her kitchen table by candlelight. "Ladies and gentlemen," a booming voice echoed through the speakers. "Please join me in welcoming the man who is rewriting our skyline, Julian Torrance, and his lovely wife, Lydia." The applause was deafening. Clarice watched from the dark as Julian stepped onto the stage, his hand resting possessively on the small of Lydia's back. He looked radiant. He looked like a man who had never known a day of struggle. "I couldn't have done it without the support of my family," Julian said into the microphone, his voice smooth as silk. "Lydia has been my rock through my years abroad. Her belief in me kept me going when things were most difficult." The lie hit Clarice like a physical blow. A gasp escaped her lips, and for a moment she felt the room spin. Lydia? Lydia hadn't even known him when he was eating ramen in a cold London flat. Lydia hadn't sold her mother's wedding ring to pay his tuition. Clarice felt a hand on her arm. She flinched, turning to see a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with a rugged, understated elegance that stood out against the peacocking socialites. He held a camera in one hand and a glass of water in the other. "You look like you're about to faint or commit a murder," the man said softly. His voice was deep, grounded. "I'd suggest the water first." "I'm fine," Clarice snapped, her voice trembling. "I'm Caleb Ross," he said, ignoring her brush-off. He was a freelance investigative journalist, though Clarice didn't know that yet. He'd been trailing the Torrance success story for weeks, smelling a rat in the timeline of Julian's sudden rise. "You're not on the guest list, are you? You have the look of someone who knows where the bodies are buried." Clarice looked at Caleb. His eyes were kind but piercing, the kind of eyes that saw through facades. For a second she felt an inexplicable urge to tell him everything, to scream that the man on the stage was a fraud and a bigamist. But she held her tongue. She wasn't here for a witness, she was here for a reckoning. "I'm his past," Clarice whispered, more to herself than him. She stepped out from behind the curtain. The movement was slow, deliberate. She walked toward the stage, the light catching the shimmering silk of her dress. The crowd didn't notice her at first, but Julian did. His mid-sentence laugh died in his throat. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray that no amount of expensive tanning could hide. He stopped speaking. The silence stretched, turning the room's energy from celebratory to awkward. "Julian," Lydia whispered, touching his arm. "What is it?" Clarice stopped at the foot of the stage. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply looked up at him, her gaze a searing brand of truth. "You forgot your luggage, Julian," Clarice said, her voice projecting with a clarity that shocked even her. "Or perhaps you just forgot the woman who bought the tickets." The room went deathly silent. Lydia's eyes darted between her husband and the stranger in the handmade dress. Julian's mouth moved but no sound came out. He was a cornered animal in a $5,000 suit. "Who is this woman?" Lydia asked, her voice rising in pitch. Julian finally found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. I have no idea. A disgruntled former employee, perhaps? Security." The betrayal was complete. He hadn't just ghosted her. He was actively erasing her existence in front of the world. Two large men in black suits began to move toward Clarice. "Don't bother," Clarice said, stepping back with her head held high. She looked directly at Caleb Ross, who was already snapping photos with a grim smile. "I'm leaving. But Julian, check your email. I think you'll find the bill for the last 7 years is finally due. And I'm not accepting installments anymore." As she turned to walk out, the first major twist dropped like a guillotine. "Wait," a voice called out. It was an older man, the benefactor of the evening. "Mr. Torrance, is this true? Because the moral clause in your partnership contract is very specific. And if there is a legal wife we don't know about." Julian looked at Lydia, then at the benefactor, and then at Clarice's retreating back. He took a step forward, ready to plead, but Lydia's hand dropped from his arm as if he were made of fire. She had seen the terror in his eyes, the terror of a man whose house of cards had just met a gale-force wind. Clarice walked out of the Pierre Hotel and into the cold night air. Her heart was still racing, but the fear was gone. The war had officially begun. The morning after the gala, the city felt different to Clarice. Sharper, more dangerous, yet somehow full of possibility. She sat in a small, dimly lit booth at a corner diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease swirling around her. Opposite her sat Caleb Ross, his laptop open and a stack of printed documents between them. "You're a ghost in his paper trail, Clarice," Caleb said, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through a database. He was smart. He used your money through untraceable wire transfers or cash deposits. On paper, Julian Torrance looks like a self-made man who lived on a private scholarship, while in London. "The scholarship was me," Clarice said, her voice hard. "I skipped meals so he could pay for that scholarship." "I know," Caleb replied softly, his eyes meeting hers with a flash of genuine heat. "But in the eyes of the law, especially international law, we need more than your word. We need the how. And I think I found it." He turned the laptop toward her. "He didn't just marry Lydia for love, Clarice. Her father's firm, Montgomery Holdings, is the primary financier for the new Skyline project. If Julian isn't married to her, the contracts are void. He's not just a liar, he's a corporate liability. As they talked, the tension between them shifted. It wasn't just the shared goal of taking Julian down, it was the way Caleb looked at her, not with pity but with a burgeoning respect that made Clarice's skin tingle. He treated her like an equal, a partner in a high-stakes game. "Why are you helping me, Caleb?" she asked, her hand brushing his as she reached for a document. Caleb paused, his fingers lingering near hers. "Because I've spent my career chasing people who think they're too big to fail. And because..." He paused, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. "I've never seen anyone stand their ground in a handmade dress quite like you did last night." But the path to justice was blocked by more than just paperwork. That afternoon, as Clarice walked back to her apartment, a black sedan pulled up alongside her. The window rolled down to reveal Julian. He looked haggard, the polished veneer from the night before cracked. "Get in, Clarice," he hissed. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," she said, quickening her pace. "I can make your life very difficult," Julian threatened, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Lydia's father has lawyers who can tie you up in court until you're old and gray. Or you can take this." He held out a thick envelope. "It's more money than you've ever seen. Take it, disappear, and let me live my life." Clarice stopped. She looked at the envelope. The price of her silence, the price of 7 years of her life. For a moment, the ghost of the woman who loved him wavered. With that money, she could finally open her boutique. She could stop the double shifts. Then she looked Julian in the eye. "You think you can buy the years you stole? You think my dignity has a price tag?" She leaned into the window, her voice a cold whisper. "Keep your money, Julian. You're going to need it for your bail." She turned and walked away, but the encounter left her shaken. Julian wasn't just going to disappear, he was going to fight dirty. Within hours, the retaliation began. Clarice arrived at her laundry shop to find the locks changed and a notice of eviction pinned to the door. Julian had contacted the landlord, claiming Clarice was using the premises for illegal activities. Then her bank account, the one she had shared with Julian years ago, was frozen due to suspicious activity reports. He was trying to starve her out, to strip away the very foundation of the life she had managed to build while he was away. She met Caleb that evening at a park bench, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. "He took everything, Caleb. Stop the money. I have nothing left." Caleb sat beside her, his presence a warm anchor in the storm. He didn't offer platitudes. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. "He didn't take everything. He forgot that you have the truth. And he forgot that I have friends in high places who love a good scandal." He leaned in closer, his shoulder pressing against hers. "We're going to find the one thing he can't bribe his way out of. We're going to find the original marriage license from the village. The one he thinks he destroyed." Clarice felt a flicker of hope. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, but it was there. As they sat in the gathering dark, planning their next move, she realized she was no longer just the woman who was ghosted. She was a woman rising from the ashes, and for the first time in a long time she wasn't alone. The rain lashed against the windows of Caleb's cramped apartment, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury Julian now inhabited. 4 hours, Clarice and Caleb had been digging through the digital footprints of Julian's new skyline project. The deeper they went, the more the numbers stopped making sense. "Clarice, look at this," Caleb said, his voice tight with an adrenaline-fueled edge. He pointed at a series of subcontracts for the project's foundation. "These companies don't exist. They're shell corporations registered in the Caymans, all linked back to an offshore account." Clarice leaned in, her hair still damp from the storm. "I don't understand. Julian was always brilliant at design. Why would he risk everything on a financial scam?" "Because he's not just a bigamist, Clarice. He's a fraud," Caleb whispered, turning to face her. "I've been cross-referencing his award-winning blueprints from London with older, obscure architectural journals from the 1980s. He didn't design the new skyline. He stole it. He found the unpublished works of a deceased architect and put his name on them to win the Montgomery family's favor." The revelation felt like a bucket of ice water. The man she had sacrificed her life for wasn't even the genius she thought he was. He was a thief who had stolen her money to buy the time to steal another man's soul. "But that's not the biggest twist," Caleb continued, his eyes searching hers. I found the connection between Julian and Lydia's father. Montgomery isn't being fooled. He knows the designs are stolen. He's using Julian as a fall guy. If the project collapses or the fraud is exposed, Julian takes the prison sentence, and Montgomery walks away with the insurance payout and the land. The stakes had just doubled. Julian wasn't just the villain in Clarice's story. He was a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. We have to tell him, Clarice said, her heart warring with her head. Tell him. Caleb stood up, pacing the small room. Clarice, he ghosted you. He tried to evict you. He's a bigamist. I know, she shouted back, her voice echoing off the walls. But if he goes down for this, the money he stole from me, the money I worked for, is gone forever. And Lydia, she's an innocent in this part of the lie. I want my justice, Caleb, but I don't want blood on my hands from a trap I didn't set. In the heat of the argument, the space between them vanished. The frustration and the shared danger culminated in a moment of raw, electric vulnerability. Caleb stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and the immense capacity for grace that Julian had never deserved. You are incredible, Caleb breathed. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. This wasn't the desperate, transactional love she had known with Julian. This was something built on truth. Clarice leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second of peace amidst the war. Caleb leaned down, and for a moment the world outside, the lawsuits, the betrayals, the rain, ceased to exist as they shared a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. But the peace was shattered by a heavy pounding on the door. Clarice jumped back, her heart in her throat. Caleb moved to the door, peering through the peephole. He turned back to Clarice, his face pale. It's Lydia, he whispered. Caleb opened the door. Lydia Montgomery stood there, her designer coat soaked, her makeup running down her face. She looked at Caleb, then at Clarice. She didn't look like a rival. She looked like a woman whose world had just ended. I found the papers, Lydia sobbed, holding up a folder. The marriage license from your village. Julian tried to burn it in the fireplace tonight, but I caught him. I thought you were just a stalker. But you're his wife. She collapsed into a chair, her body racking with tremors. And that's not all. I heard my father talking on the phone. They're planning to move the final funds tonight and leave Julian to face the authorities tomorrow morning. Clarice. He's a monster, but he's my husband. What do I do? Clarice looked at the woman who had replaced her. She saw the same shadows of betrayal she had felt at the airport. In that moment, the two women weren't enemies. They were both victims of a man who treated people like building blocks. We're going to do what we should have done from the start, Clarice said, her voice dropping into a deadly, calm register. We're going to take him for everything he's worth. The alliance between Clarice and Lydia was fragile, held together by the cold adhesive of shared betrayal. But before they could even formulate a plan to strike back, Julian Torrance proved exactly how dangerous a man becomes when he feels the floorboards of his life rotting away. The darkest hour didn't start with a scream, it started with a phone call. As Lydia sat trembling in Caleb's kitchen, her phone buzzed on the table. It was Julian. His voice wasn't the smooth, architectural melody it had been for years. It was jagged, frantic, and laced with a terrifying edge. Lydia, don't say a word. Just listen, Julian hissed. I know where you are. I know you're with her. If you think you're going to walk into my office and hand over those files to the board, you're mistaken. I've already contacted the authorities. I've told them Clarice is an obsessed stalker who has been extorting me for years, and that you, in your fragile state, have been coerced into helping her. Clarice watched Lydia's face turn ashen. Julian, stop this, Lydia whispered. It's too late to stop, Julian snapped. If I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. And Clarice, if you can hear me, I've made sure your friend Caleb Ross never works in this city again. I've filed a report with his editor claiming he's been fabricating the Montgomery investigation for personal gain. You're all finished. The line went dead. The weight of the situation crashed down on the small apartment. Caleb checked his email, his face hardening as he saw a suspension pending investigation notice from his agency. Julian had struck first, and he had struck at the one thing Caleb valued most: his integrity. He's framed us, Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. By the time we get the truth to the light, he'll have the funds transferred and be on a private jet out of the country. Montgomery has the local police in his pocket. We aren't just fighting a husband anymore, we're fighting a machine. Then the situation turned from professional ruin to physical terror. A heavy thud sounded at the door, followed by the splintering of wood. Julian hadn't just called. He had sent security to retrieve his wife and the documents she carried. Through the fire escape. Now! Caleb shouted, grabbing his hard drive in Clarice's hand. They scrambled out into the freezing rain, the metal stairs slick and treacherous. Below them, the alleyway was a maze of shadows. Clarice's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning. She looked at Lydia, who was struggling to keep up in her expensive, impractical heels. For a moment, Clarice felt a flicker of the old resentment. Lydia had the life Clarice paid for. But then she saw the sheer terror in the younger woman's eyes and she reached out, grabbing Lydia's hand. "Don't look down," Clarice commanded. "Just move." They reached the bottom only to find their path blocked. A black SUV had pulled into the alley, its headlights blinding them. Out stepped Julian. He wasn't the polished architect anymore. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He held a thick folder in one hand and looked at them with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "Give me the license, Lydia," Julian said, stepping into the light. "And Clarice, you should have stayed in the village. You were a means to an end. Why couldn't you just accept that?" "Because I'm the one who built you, Julian." Clarice stepped in front of Lydia, her voice a whip crack in the rain. "I gave you every cent, every dream, every prayer. You didn't just take my money, you took my time. You took my youth. And you think I'm going to let you walk away with a lie?" "I don't think," Julian sneered, signaled to the two men behind him. "I know." The men moved forward. Caleb stepped in to intervene, but he was shoved back against the brick wall, the wind knocked out of him. In the chaos, Julian lunged for the folder in Lydia's arms. The three of them struggled in the mud and rain, a bitter, ugly fight for the evidence of a stolen life. With a brutal shove, Julian pushed Clarice to the ground. Her head hit the pavement and for a second the world went black. She heard Lydia's scream, the roar of the SUV's engine, and the splashing of water as they drove away. When Clarice opened her eyes, Caleb was kneeling over her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Lydia was gone. The folder was gone. "He took her," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with frustration. "He took the evidence and he took Lydia. Clarice, we have nothing. No proof, no witnesses, and the police think we're the criminals." Clarice sat up, the rain washing the blood from her temple. She looked at her empty hands, the hands that had worked so hard for so long. She felt a coldness settle into her bones that wasn't from the weather. It was the absolute bottom. Everything she had tried to reclaim was gone, and the man who ghosted her had finally succeeded in making her invisible. "He thinks he won," Clarice said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Clarice, he has everything," Caleb said, sounding defeated for the first time. "No," Clarice said, standing up with a grim, terrifying resolve. "He has the papers. He has the money. But he forgot that I'm the one who taught him how to think. And I know exactly where a man like Julian goes when he thinks he's escaped the ghost." The silence in the aftermath of the struggle was heavier than the rain. Caleb sat on the wet pavement, his head in his hands, but Clarice stood tall, her silhouette sharp against the flickering streetlights. The physical pain in her temple was nothing compared to the sudden, icy clarity crystallizing in her mind. "Caleb, get up," Clarice said, her voice vibrating with a new, terrifying authority. "Clarice, he has the documents. He has Lydia. He's going to use her family's influence to disappear," Caleb groaned, wiping blood from his eye. "We're beaten." "No," Clarice replied, reaching down to haul him to his feet. "Julian is a builder of facades, Caleb. He spends so much time making sure the front of the house looks perfect that he forgets to check the foundation. He thinks he took everything, but he left the one thing that actually matters." "What?" "The login," Clarice whispered. "Remember the synchronized cloud account? He changed the password to his personal folders, but he didn't change the access to the project servers. He's so arrogant that he thinks I'm too uneducated to understand the technical side of his work. But I spent 7 years proofreading his architectural theses. I know his filing system better than he does." They rushed back into the apartment, the air thick with tension. Clarice's fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't looking for marriage certificates anymore. She was looking for the structural integrity of the new skyline project. If Julian stole those designs from the 1980s, he didn't just steal the beauty, Clarice muttered, her eyes scanning lines of data. He stole the flaws. Those old designs were abandoned for a reason. Here, look. She pointed to a structural stress report hidden deep within a subfolder. The 1982 blueprints had a catastrophic resonance failure in the cantilevered supports. Julian didn't fix it, he just draped it in glass and steel to make it look modern. He's not just a fraud, Caleb, he's building a death trap. And Montgomery knows. They're going to let it be built, take the money and let it fall when the insurance is signed. The realization hit them like a physical wave. This wasn't just about a broken heart or a stolen inheritance anymore. It was about hundreds of lives. If we can prove the building is unsafe before the final concrete pour tonight, Caleb realized, his journalist instincts reigniting, the city will freeze every asset associated with the project. Julian won't be able to flee because he'll be under criminal investigation for public endangerment. But they needed one more thing. A witness from the inside. Clarice's phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. It was a live location pin at the new skyline construction site, and a single photo, a shot of Julian's burner phone sitting on a dashboard. Lydia, Clarice breathed. She's not just a hostage. She's playing him. She's keeping him there. In that moment, the romantic tension between Clarice and Caleb sparked again, but this time it was fueled by a shared mission. Caleb grabbed his jacket, looking at Clarice with a mixture of awe and devotion. "You're the smartest person I've ever met," he said. "I'm just a woman who's done waiting for her life to start," Clarice replied. They didn't call the police, not yet. They knew the police were compromised. Instead, Clarice called Arthur Sterling, the hardware store owner. "Arthur," she said when he picked up. "I need the old union guys. The ones who worked the site before Montgomery fired them all. I need men who know how to read a structural crack and aren't afraid of a fight." The turning point was complete. Clarice Holloway was no longer the victim. She was the architect of a counterstrike. She had found her inner strength not in the love of a man, but in the truth of her own worth. She was going to the construction site not to beg for her husband back, but to tear down the hollow empire he had built on her back. "Let's go," Clarice said, her eyes flashing like steel. "It's time to show Julian what happens when the foundation decides to move." The new skyline construction site loomed over the city like a skeletal giant, draped in shadows and flickering work lights. The air was cold, smelling of wet concrete and ozone. Up on the 50th floor, the unfinished penthouse, the wind howled through the open steel beams. Julian stood at the edge, his back to the drop, clutching the folder. Lydia stood 5 feet away, her face bruised but her eyes fixed on the elevator banks. "The transfer is 60% complete," Julian muttered, staring at a tablet. "Once it hits 100, we're gone, Lydia. Your father is already at the private hangar. He thinks I'm a fool, but I've redirected half of his share to my own accounts." "You're insane, Julian," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "They're going to find out. The building will stand long enough for us to be on a beach in a country with no extradition," Julian snapped. Suddenly, the service elevator groaned to a halt. The doors slid open and Clarice stepped out. She wasn't alone. Caleb was at her side, holding a high-definition camera rigged for a live stream, and behind them stood Arthur Sterling and 4 grizzled, retired union foremen. "The foundation is already shifting, Julian," Clarice said, her voice carrying over the wind. "We've been live for 10 minutes. There are 3,000 people watching this right now, including the city building inspector and the evening news." Julian let out a panicked laugh. "A live stream? About what?" "My successful career. About the 1982 resonance flaw in the cantilevered supports," Clarice said, stepping forward onto the precarious plywood flooring. She didn't look at the height, she looked only at the man who had ghosted her. "Arthur, show him." Arthur, a man who had spent 40 years in steel, pointed a laser level at the central beam. The red dot danced, not because his hand was shaking but because the beam was vibrating at a frequency the human eye couldn't catch but a sensor could. "The concrete pour you're doing on 48 right now is adding weight the structure can't support," Arthur shouted. "In 20 minutes the resonance will hit the critical point. This whole wing is going to pancake." Julian's face went white. "You're lying. You're trying to scare me." Check the tablet, Julian, Caleb interjected, holding up his own device. I just bypassed your encryption and sent the original 1980s blueprints to the building department. They've already issued an emergency stop work order and a warrant for your arrest for reckless endangerment with intent to defraud. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a low hum growing into a scream as police cruisers swarmed the base of the tower. Julian looked at the tablet, then at the elevator, then at the drop behind him. He was trapped. The polished, brilliant architect was gone. In his place was a small, terrified boy who had stolen things he didn't understand. Lydia, come here. Julian reached for her, his eyes wild. Tell them it's a mistake. Tell them your father approved it. Lydia stepped back, moving toward Clarice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I don't have to tell them anything, Julian. I've been recording you since we left Caleb's apartment. I have your confession about the shell companies, the stolen designs, and the fact that you knew the building was unsafe. In a final, desperate act of cowardice, Julian lunged for Clarice, intending to use her as a shield or a way to force the police back. But Clarice didn't flinch. As he reached for her, she used the weight of his own momentum, the same way he had used her love, and stepped aside, catching his arm and twisting it behind his back with the strength of a woman who had spent years lifting heavy laundry bags and pulling her own weight. She pinned him against a structural pillar. Her face was inches from his. 7 years, Julian, she whispered, her voice like ice. You thought I was the weak one because I gave. But giving takes strength. Taking is for the weak. The elevator doors burst open again, this time filled with tactical police officers. They swarmed the floor, pulling Julian away from Clarice and forcing him to the ground. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the sound was the most satisfying thing Clarice had ever heard. As they led him away, Julian looked back at her, his eyes pleading for a mercy she no longer possessed. Clarice, please. I can fix this. I can give you the money. I don't want your money, Julian, Clarice said, standing next to Caleb and Lydia. I already took back my life. That's worth more than anything you could ever pay me. The most surprising twist came as the lead investigator approached. Miss Holloway, we've been reviewing the records Mr. Ross sent over. Since you are the legal wife and provided the initial capital for his firm, and since the Montgomery contracts are being liquidated due to fraud, you are the primary creditor for his remaining assets. It's not much after the fines, but the patent for his actual original student designs, the ones that are actually safe, belongs to you. Clarice looked at Caleb, who was beaming with pride. She had won. Not just a legal battle but a total reclamation of her identity. The building behind them might have been hollow, but for the first time in a decade, Clarice felt completely solid. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a revitalized brick warehouse in the heart of the city's design district. The scent of fresh espresso and expensive fabric had replaced the stale smell of laundry steam. A sleek brass sign by the door read, Holloway and Ross, Creative Restorations. Clarice Holloway stood at a large drafting table, her hands, still strong but now manicured and steady, smoothly unfolding a set of blueprints. She wasn't just a tailor anymore. She had used the restitution funds and the patents she reclaimed to open a boutique firm that specialized in honest architecture, taking old, abandoned structures and making them safe and beautiful again. She had finally merged her talent for precision with the dreams she had deferred for so long. The permits for the Riverside project just cleared, a voice said from the doorway. Clarice looked up and smiled. Caleb Ross walked in carrying 2 coffees. He looked different than the man she had met in the shadows of the Pierre Hotel. The weary edge in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. After the scandal broke, his investigative series on the Montgomery fraud had won him national acclaim, but he had chosen to leave the frantic world of daily news to handle the research and legal advocacy for their shared firm. We're making a difference, Caleb, Clarice said, taking her coffee. Real buildings. Real foundations. And real people, Caleb added, stepping closer. He reached out, his hand finding hers over the blueprints. The connection was effortless, built not on sacrifice or desperation, but on mutual respect and a love that had been forged in the fire of their shared battle. I talked to Lydia today. She's doing well. Lydia Montgomery had used her remaining personal inheritance to start a foundation for women who had suffered financial abuse. She and Clarice remained close, two survivors who had turned a shared tragedy into a sisterhood of strength. Julian, meanwhile, was serving a 15-year sentence for fraud and endangerment, his name a cautionary tale in every architectural textbook in the country. He had become the ghost he once tried to make of Clarice. Clarice looked around her studio. On the wall hung the old framed photograph from her wedding day. She hadn't thrown it away. She kept it as a reminder of the girl she used to be, the one who believed that love meant disappearing. Now she knew better. Love was about being seen, being supported, and building something that could weather any storm. "Are you ready for the opening tonight?" Caleb asked, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "I am," Clarice said, her voice full of peace. "For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for someone to come home. I'm already there." As the evening approached, the studio filled with friends. Arthur Sterling, the union workers who had stood by her, and even some of the neighbors who had once whispered about her. They didn't see a ghosted wife anymore. They saw a titan. Clarice stepped out onto the balcony, looking at the city skyline. One building was conspicuously missing. The new skyline project had been dismantled and was being rebuilt from the ground up under her firm's supervision. The view was clear, the air was fresh, and the future was hers to design. What an incredible journey! From the heartbreak of the airport to the triumph of her own design studio, Clarice has shown us that your past doesn't define you, your resilience does. I am so moved by her happy ending, and I hope you are too. I want to hear from you. What was your favorite part of Clarice's journey? Was it the moment she stood up to Julian, or the beautiful new life she built with Caleb? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this story. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more emotional, high-stakes stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Until next time, keep believing in your own strength.